Good afternoon, Ruben.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm trying to get everyone in to the right rooms where they need to be.
Totally.
Chris, do you have the slide deck? Are you going to be able to, do you want to drive
Um,
that?
yeah, I can drive it, or Rochelle.
Okay,
Rochelle
I'll make sure.
generally likes to drive, so
Let me move people into the right spaces.
yep.
Good afternoon, everybody. I just had one of those moments where you see like a celebrity and you're like, "Oh my gosh, Millie's in the panel with me. I'm so excited." Hi, Millie.
That's right.
I love you too, Demetria.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you?
Hi.
Good afternoon.
I really have to stop talking when I see you guys and I haven't joined the panel yet. Like I'm speaking and I'm not on the panel. So it's starting to weigh on my nerves that I keep doing it over and over again.
And Trustee Smith-Folds, you are on.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Academic Committee, our special meeting on race and equity. We are getting ready to start, but before we do, I'm going to read a little bit of our opening procedures. As authorized by the Governor's Emergency Executive Order issued on March 17, 2020, the West Contra Costa Unified School District will conduct the board academic committee meetings via video conference/teleconference until further notice. This meeting will be streamed via Zoom. This meeting will provide public comment opportunities through the Zoom app or by telephone. To indicate your desire to speak on an agenda item, raise your hand by clicking on the appropriate icon in the Zoom app or by pressing *9 if accessing the meeting by phone. In order to be recognized to speak, you must be logged in with your first and last name, and your hand must be raised before public comment begins for the item. Due to the Brown Act, board members cannot discuss items that are not on the agenda and do not usually respond to items presented in public comment. Mr. Aurelio, may we have roll call, please?
Trustee Smith-Folds.
Present.
Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy.
Present.
All here and accounted for.
Thank you so much. Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy, would you please do us the honor of reading the land acknowledgement?
I'll be happy to. Thank you, Trustee Smith-Folds. Good evening, everyone. We recognize that we are presently on the lands of the Chochenyo, Muwekma, Karkin, Ohlone peoples and acknowledge them as the first inhabitants of the land we currently occupy. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so very much. Approval of the agenda. Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy, anything to add or delete?
No, I make a motion to approve the agenda, sis.
Good. I second that. And if there is no dissension, agenda approved. All right, approval of the minutes. We're doing March 22nd, April the 21st, and April the 26th. Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy, any corrections to the minutes?
I did not have any corrections. I wanted to just thank Miss Sherry. I just blanked on her last name for taking the minutes.
Rivenbark.
Rivenbark, thank you so much for taking great minutes. I didn't have any changes, Chair Smith-Folds.
I agree. So can you move that for me?
Happy to. I move all three sets of minutes.
I agree. Seeing no dissension or hearing no dissension, so moved. All right, so agenda approved, minutes approved. Mr. Aurelio, do we have any public comment?
All right, I am going to stop my share. That's by Don. I am not seeing any hands raised for public comment for items not on the agenda.
Okay. And then can we get a staff update, please?
Yeah, so good evening, everyone. I'm glad you're all with us today. I know this is a special meeting. There was no school today. It was one of our reserved smoke days. So our teachers in the audience, our principals in the audience, I thank you for joining us. I know it is a non-work day for you all, and I did send you an invite, and I want to just honor you all for being here and taking some time this evening. As far as updates, we are moving along. I want to say this is week 4 of in-person instruction in the spring, with obviously we keep trying to add additional students to our enrollment. We are shifting gears, at least from the ed services and in the school site level. We're really trying to focus now on summer and really ramping up to get our summer programming going. My estimate at this point is that the summer offering will be larger than the number of students we're serving in the spring. My rough estimate at this point is that it would be roughly 2,000 more students than we're currently serving this spring, somewhere between the 7,000 to 8,000 student range. So we're just ramping up right now. Sites are securing their staffing for summer. We have a lot of interest, a lot of teachers who are coming back to in-person for summer. It's just exciting work. We're really happy and looking forward to that work ahead.
Thank you so very much. Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy, any questions about the staff update?
I don't have any questions. Thank you, Chair Smith-Folds.
You're welcome. And I don't have any questions right now about staff update. Do we have any public comment on staff update?
Giving it a second. I don't see any hands raised. So no public comment on that.
We're knocking it out of the water. All right, so we are going to go to agenda item number 2, discussion about race and equity. It is time to get uncomfortable. So let's go. We want everyone to get uncomfortable. We want the unbridled truth, and we want to, this is it. This is time to put it all on the table like a buffet. So let's lay it out. Mr. Aurelio, I will yield to you. And Mr. Gonzalez-Hoy, Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy, same old thing. We're going to do questions, then we'll take public comment, and then we'll go discussion, and we'll do it as much as we need to do it. You know, we're easy. Okay.
Right.
Right.
So I am really excited to have this meeting. I know we created a special meeting to ensure that we had the opportunity to really focus on this topic at hand. As you can see from the panelists, we have quite a few of us here. The group that you're seeing makes up the small equity planning team that the district, I think everyone in here has essentially committed to doing this work during this school year and has been meeting on a regular basis trying to ensure that our schools and our organization had the content for meetings and sessions. I do want to introduce we have 3 consultants on this call with us. We have Dr. Christopher Naus, Dr. Rochelle Rogers-Ard, and Millie, I don't even know if you're a doctor. Are you a doctor, Millie? Can I call you Dr. Burns? No? All right, Millie Burns. 3 of our fantastic consultants who have worked with us this year and really helped us hold this work. And there is going to be a presentation, and staff members who are also part of this call will have an opportunity to jump in and introduce and speak to this work. So I'm going to ask Christopher Naus if he has the slide deck up. We can get going because we want to have enough opportunity for questions and discussion.
And this is not the uncomfort you were asking for, but Dr. Rochelle Rogers-Ard, if I'm driving, I actually can't do the Slido, so I'm not going to ask you to do so.
Oh, okay.
No problem. Give me one moment to bring that
Sorry,
up.
apologies for that. See, already starting uncomfortable.
That is okay. My mother just called on the phone, and I mean,
Exactly.
clearly she just doesn't understand when I say I'm in a meeting at 4 o'clock. So she's like, so it is okay. We have plenty of time.
And while you're doing that, we have just a few others to introduce. We have Will Mcgee, our Director of Office of African American Student Achievement. We have LaShante Smith, our Director of Positive School Climate. Welcome back, LaShante. I know we haven't seen you in a bit. We have Christine Hatcher, Principal at Riverside Elementary. I don't see Michael Hatcher here. We have Sato Wilson, no windows at Richmond High. Sato, are you president of the Black Educator Network? I forget your title exactly, or is it chair?
That is correct.
President, okay, great. Who's joining us as well. And did I miss any? My screen shifted and I don't see Michael Hatcher, but if he joins us, we will be promoting him as well.
Thanks, Doc.
All right, so.
Okay, so hi, everybody. Thanks so much. We finally got this, reshared the screen. Thanks so much for being here. We are going to take some time to share the work. I'm Rochelle. We're going to share some work that we've done around centering anti-racist authenticity over the past, my Lord, 7 to 8 months now. And so wanted Ruben, if you could just share for a quick 3 or 4 minutes about why we are here in terms of the context that led to West Contra Costa reaching out to to us as consultants to help us do this work.
Definitely, thank you. And actually, I went back and did my homework and found the video of the very first session we did back in September. I had a lot less facial hair then when watching the video, but I found the slide deck that we utilized to frame this work as far as our year ahead. And there was a number of different things that really stood out to me. Obviously, the country was in a lot of pain at the moment. There was a lot of just challenges. I mean, I'm looking at Chris' background right now, and that's just a constant reminder of where our country is and where our students were and our families were. There was really a height of some real tension in our system. So that was one thing that we definitely named when we started talking about this work. But the other things, we actually named a couple policy shifts and changes. So the district over the past 2 to 3 years has adopted some policy shifts, some resolutions that really named the inequities that our Black students were facing. Particularly, we did a resolution on positive school climate, where we were really paying attention to and focusing our efforts on reducing the suspensions of Black students. That is something that when I came into this district, that's now 3 years ago, had just recently been adopted. And there was a change in policies and how suspensions were to be handled, approval process for suspending students, African-American students, when that came up. Another resolution that was brought was a resolution that passed a year ago, January, which was a resolution in support of the achievement and success of African-American Black students. And that resolution was definitely one that named quite a few different actions, including putting money and dollars behind an effort to really curtail this just systemic and historical inequities we've seen in education for our Black students. So those were some things that prompted this work, in addition to a commitment from the district at the time that this was not going to be a one and done process. This was not going to be a PD you checked off that you then could say, okay, I'm now an anti-racist teacher, or I'm an anti-racist administrator. That this was the beginning of work that would need to continue, and a wholesale commitment by the district to get behind that. One of the ways we were able to do that was obviously structurally. This year, as challenging and difficult as it was, it did provide us an opportunity for increased professional learning and adult learning. The Friday structure, which is something we have carried throughout the year, is something unique to the pandemic, of course, but that really allowed for additional time to get behind this work. We also made some structural changes, partnering with our unions, creating the race and equity lead positions. Probably some of my favorite times during the week is when I get to spend time with the race equity leads and their training. I think that's the most real meetings we have, where real discussions happen around progress that we're making or not making. And I think that's a really important piece. So all of that really framed the work that was needed. I mean, historically, we have not served our Black students. That's just point blank. We do not do a great job of doing that as a district. We haven't done it in years, and definitely not since I've been here. And so that is the work that this has prompted. We committed to not only working with teachers and administrators, but really every member of this organization was asked basically voluntold to come to these trainings. It was a mandated component Everyone from a custodian to a food services worker to a secretary or admin assistant, everyone was receiving this training, including cabinet members all the way down. So those are the context where this work began. I will be honest, it's been extremely messy, but I think that comes with the territory, and it's a necessary mess for us to continue to grow and adapt and change and really focus the attention that's necessary to make improvements for our Black students.
Thank you so much, Ruben. That was super thorough. Appreciate you going back to the very beginning to provide context for the work that we are still continuing to do. So what I have here is a little chance for us to not just do sit and get. It is participatory, and I think it works for everybody who has access to the slide deck. So what I need you to do is to take your phone device, access your phone app, your camera app, and then hold it over the QR code. It will open up a question for you in Slido. And the question is, how does the multiple sustained murders of global majority people relate to our academic mission? And so I'm asking that you would write your response, and then it will come up into our Slido. So in what ways does the multiple sustained murders of folks of the global majority, how does that relates to the academic mission for WCCUSD, and also understanding that you can access it from slido.com. So I see that no one has responded yet. So feel free again, take your camera. There we go. It's not reflected. We can't educate students who are not alive. Survival's the purpose. We are responsible for raising our youth to be allies. Okay, others? 4 responses. I'm just going to give a moment for a couple more. Just in case you can, if you don't want to use your phone, you can go to slido.com 376323. Our youth are continually traumatized. I'm pretty sure is what that was supposed to be there. I'm going to give a couple more minutes. We need to empower our youth and provide them with tools to navigate. Absolutely. Because our youth are continually traumatized. Anyone else want to throw in there? Misrepresentation. We have to prepare our Black youth how to navigate and persevere in the world outside of school, especially after navigation. And it relates in terms of we having to live with what is seen, right? Or as I like to say, Chris and I like to say, you know, the images in our hands that we continue to see have serious damaging effects on our youth. And then school can be, for some youth, their only outlet, right? To talk about how these issues affect them. And if we don't provide that safe space, or as we really are saying, that brave space to have those conversations, then they may not have them, right? So I appreciate those of you who did participate in the poll. It, you know, I don't do sit and get, so wanted to make sure that we have that available for you. And then addressing this mindset needs to be one of the highest priority things we do. Super, super important, right? This is the work. I think a lot of times when we think about racial equity, it's, oh, that's what we do after we do everything else. But the reality is we have to shift our mindset and our framing that racial equity is the work and everything else follows after that. So thank you for those of you who participated. Just wanted to share this quote, that you are either choosing to do the work of becoming actively anti-racist and confronting the inherent anti-Blackness in education, or You're choosing to sustain it. You're either choosing to do the work of becoming actively anti-racist and confronting the inherent anti-Blackness in education, or you're choosing to sustain it. And so the reality is, Kendi says there's no such thing as not racist. You're either racist or anti-racist. And that's really, really hard for us to hear, especially when the notion of racist conjures up people in white robes with white hoods. But the reality is you are either confronting and attempting to dismantle, or you are sustaining. So who we are, I'm not a fan of reading to you what you can read for yourself, but what I will just say is I'm Rochelle, and 25 plus years in Oakland Unified and other places, and now I am doing anti-racist education full-time. Chris?
25 years is the magic number. 25 years-ish, Chris Knaus, educating around racism, around anti-racism, and around our own kind of individual internalization of white supremacy, regardless of who and how we are. Part of my day job is as a professor, and much of the work that I do is working with school districts and universities around the world to think about what decolonial education looks like and what it looks like when we move from the historical purpose of schools as to silence children of color in particular.
Cool.
Yeah. So our next piece is, especially given, so who we are is relevant, but I actually think how we move is probably more relevant in our conversation. And that's a lot of how we talk about educators, modeling the way in which and prioritizing what we think is important. This country is currently in a love affair of bashing critical race theory as state after state tries to ban whatever they think is critical race theory. Part of as a critical race theory practitioner myself, I find a lot of humor when people try to ban something that they don't know what it is. It's a wonderful idea, going back to banning books, especially by authors of color. This is not a new thing that the United States does. We ban things that people of color, especially lead movements and write about it. Those are the first things that are banned. So current events around banning critical race theory just reflects historical silencing of communities of color. A really quick overview of critical race theory. We frame critical race theory as applied to schools with having 4 tenets. The first one is the recognition, as Rochelle started, that racism is everywhere and all the time. You are either actively challenging this racism or actively engaging in and benefiting from and supporting this racism. Regardless of your stance, racism is everywhere and all the time. There is no space and place we can be, past, present, or future. So this is a permanent framing of racism. So when you're surprised that racism happened, some example of racism, you're like, oh, I'm surprised that happened. That surprise is a reminder that you forgot that racism is everywhere and all the time. The second part is the historic reminder that schools have not changed their purpose. Our schools are designed to silence critical educators of color, critical students of color, and any sort of essence of culturality that has anything to do with pigmentation, color, right? The purpose of schools being to silence children of color and rewarding acquiescence to that silence. The third part is, if we're challenging the silencing, then critical race theory argues that we foster critical voices of communities of color, in particular students and educators of color, and listen to kind of counter stories, or stories that illustrate the context of what racism does to educators of color, students of color within this context. And the fourth piece is that systems autocorrect. So every time we try to center racial justice conversations, every time we try to decenter white supremacy, every time we do a new initiative, this is why people get so tired. Systems autocorrect and decenter that initiative to recenter whiteness and white supremacy as the normalized everyday way of being. So we use critical race theory as an organizational way to think about how do we decenter racism and whiteness so that we can essentially center what it means to be authentically of color, strong voice, and then you leave school armed with the ability to know how to move in a world that is anti-you.
So also in terms of how we move, Chris and I model the possibility of inclusive, diverse, and equitable collaboration across difference and oppressions. Chris as a white male, myself as African-American female, we in and of itself, the fact that we move together, write together, teach together, if we are modeling the possibility of what it looks like to be inclusive, diverse, and to have equitable collaboration. So here's our theory of action. We call this the 5 Ds. To address racism, we must define the elements of white supremacy. We can no longer continue to pretend that white supremacy does not exist. So we must define it so that we can disrupt those same elements, and that will lead to the dismantling of those elements. Define, disrupt, and dismantle in society, in schools, and in ourselves, critically important there, so that we can dream and design anti-racist educational structures, so that we can dream what is possible, so that we can design what is possible. That's our theory of action. So given that theory of action, here's our essential question. Given unabated public anti-Black racist violence, and this is what we want you to grapple with. How does West Contra Costa create the conditions for Black and brown children and leaders to move beyond fighting for survival? As our colleague Bettina Love says, we want to do more than just survive. Survival is no longer good enough. So how does West Contra Costa create the conditions for Black and brown children and leaders to move beyond fighting for survival? And that was our essential question as we began this work. Have not answered it. Still lots of work to do. But this is how we've shown you who we are. We show you how we move. And now we've shown you our essential question that's guiding our work. So allow us to introduce our implementation team. I think Ruben did some of this already. We did introduce LaShante Smith, Will Mcgee, Millie, Matt Duffy was our superintendent leading this, Aceto Wilson, and Michael and Christine Hatcher. So we're going to really quickly talk about some of the racial equity work that we did. We're going to ask the participants of the ESI, the Equity Strategic Implementation Team, to talk about the context, showing us our local mirror, and then the supports that were in place. So for context, Will?
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you guys are doing well. Good afternoon to our board members, our staff, and the community. My name is William Mcgee. I'm the director of the Office of African American Student Achievement. Proud director. We've done a lot of work, but there's still work to be done. And so one of the things that has happened with this race and equity work is that we as a district said we wanted to do something. And hats off to Mr. Duffy for putting something out there. And as it was mentioned, there was still some loose ends that we needed to tie up. And this year has been messy, but to me, it's been a good messy. And the reason I say that is because a lot of our sites have engaged in the work. A lot of sites have been uncomfortable. There has been work done where sites will invite us to some of their meetings, and they're talking about some real stuff. Went to one of our high schools, PD, on Friday, and they were talking about the Black Lives Matter movement in school. And that was off the hook. And part of that is off the hook because this shelter in place has really highlighted a lot of disparities, especially for our Black African-American children and families. Some of our families have reported that they're doing well in distance learning. Several of our parents and guardians have stated, my child is actually thriving because they're not going to a school where they're oppressed or where they have to deal with the racist and uncomfortability of being in that space. So in that instance, it's been a good thing. But on the flip side, we do have a lot of our children who are struggling. The disparities can be seen by the lack of the internet access, by the lack of Wi-Fi and the availability. And so this is why it's important for us to talk about this race and equity work. And then how are we really supporting the children and families? Are we just grading to grade, or are we looking at the true learning? And so a lot of our sites have grappled with that. There's been discussions about race and equity in grading. There's been discussions about how do we really know what we're doing as far as teaching and learning. So that's been a good thing. The other reason this is important because these police killings are not anything new. The only thing to me that's new is that we're really finding out about it on a large scale, thanks to the advent of technology. I tell the story when I was younger and I asked my mother when I get to go to jail, when was it my turn? And I won't get into that now, but these are things that some of our Black children are seeing when they're dealing with schools. And so George Floyd was not the first. You got to go back to Emmett Till. You have to go back to when Black people were just brought to this country and what happened. And so these are reasons why we're discussing it. Now we're trying to make meaning of this. And so through the site or the race and equity leads, there's been discussion of how this work gets rolled out. And I know we'll talk about that, but that's can be seen because some of our sites have undertaken this work, but we haven't gone through our personal reflections. And so this is where the challenge is. Then you also look at what's happened in regard to that whole Capitol, as you see as one of our bullet points, where white people were allowed to congregate, yell, curse, do different things. You see white people walking down the street with AK-47s, but when you see a Black person with that, the response is so different, overwhelmingly. And then that also can be seen in our schools, how a white child can question something and it's seen as inquisitive, but a Black student questions something and it's seen as defiant. So these are all things that we're grappling with. And then lastly, the closing and opening of schools, how we're supporting our students. And this is the greatest opportunity for us as a district to come back and do something different, not the same, but something different to where we can really engage our students. There are some things that we have to look at, such as data points behind this work. And I believe that is the discussions that we're having now is what data points can we see around the race and equity work to really see how it's taking effect and really for the positive. And so one of the things that I'll say is that Dr. Knaus and Dr. Rogers-Ard really came to us in a great position. I've worked with them before. I was actually one of their students and they really impart some good stuff. And that's what we're looking to do for our school district, inclusive of our students and our parents and guardians. And hopefully that's where we'll start to take the conversation.
Thanks so much, Will. Appreciate that. We're going to lob it over to, I don't know if Michael is on the call, but I know Christine is. In terms of, let's look at our local mirror, holding up a mirror to our own actions and some of the things that happen within our own local context. Christine and Michael?
I don't know, did Mike make it here? He was picking up. Okay, cool. I was going to say he was picking up.
One of the children.
Here.
Children are important.
It's important that they not be left on the sidewalk. Yes, it's very important.
That's super important. Thank you.
Super important. You want me to start off, Patrick, and then you
Sure.
can kind of jump in?
Okay.
So one of the things that's always challenging is when you have a change in not just leadership, but even in the structural organization of a district. And so Mr. Duffy's tenure has been 5 years, I believe. But during that time, we saw some structural changes in terms of our district, the organizational changes of our leadership. And sometimes when that happens, there's like a shifting of priorities. And it becomes difficult to know who the work is attached to. So who we will be accountable to, and then who is accountable for that piece. Or you have conflicting agendas, even within the structure of an organization. West Contra Costa Unified is not unique in that. It happens a lot of places across a lot of districts at various times. And unfortunately, we find ourselves reacting instead of planning, instead of like a really thoughtful planning. And so in the work that we did this year, in contracting with our consultants, excuse me, I'm like tripping over my tongue, and contracting with our consultants, what we didn't want to do was just be reacting to things that were occurring, but really wanted the work to be meaningful and sustainable across a period of time, and not just a hot topic moment where folks would get behind it. But then as people's interest drifted, the understanding the importance of why this is necessary, you don't want that to go away with it too. So that's always a challenge. And I think it was one of the challenges that we encountered in the very beginning of our work before Rogers, Ard, and Canals came in, is that there were a number of things that were really important. But as when you have a number of things that are really important, what becomes really important? It becomes a challenge for people to navigate and understand.
I guess I'll take a 2-minute thing. So one of the things we talked about when we were looking at this work initially was language and essential contestedness and like, how can I say it? Polysemic. Like you can say you could say race and another person could say race, but it doesn't mean you guys are talking about the same thing on a bunch of different levels. You could say black, another person could say black, and it doesn't mean you're talking about the same thing at the same level. And so what we wanted to do was kind of start working to build a scaffolded, consistent language so that when somebody in the district, say at one site starts talking about something racial or to do with black people, it will be consistent with what somebody on another site was saying. And so we kind of started by trying to define terms. We defined where race sat in this work as will and skill. Most of us are familiar with this kind of work, right? Do you have the will and the skill to do the work? And if you have the will and not the skill, then we define that as benevolent. If you have the skill but not the will, then we define that as malevolent. So that we can start to build a really consistent language. And then when we said, well, if you have the will and skill, then you have the legitimacy to carry out the work. But then in a leadership role, it's about legitimacy and authority. And we see sometimes that people have authority without legitimacy. So basically, just to give an idea, we were trying to scaffold up language so that we could have a consistent conversation everywhere in the district. We talked about equity, race, and like Chris said last week in our presentation, race and equity are oftentimes linked and they don't need to be, right? Because you can get equitable outcomes without even dealing with race sometimes. So this is where we've been, and this is the work we kind of want to push forward to continue next year. I don't know. I think I'll pause there. Everybody knows I could talk forever.
But and in that, we wanted to dig into the structure of it, right? And so, because I'm looking at our slide, and we talked about racist violence in school. We weren't just talking about the physical act of violence. We were talking about transgressions committed against students of color, regardless of folks' intention. We were talking about the impact of that on bodies in the classroom. We were talking about the over surveillance of Black kids, specifically Black boys in classes, the regulation of bodies in class. And Mcgee touched on the fact that we did have a pretty significant response from our parents in terms of that surveillance wasn't occurring in the same way, which was lessening the anxiety of students in attending school, right? They could be successful without that type of surveillance. When we talk about systemic racism, we are talking about the policies and the practices and the cultural representations or lack of cultural representations that tend to exist in school systems. For example, when we looked at who was responsible for making decisions, there was not one Black or African-American person who sat on the superintendent's cabinet in making decisions around the things that were happening, which he acknowledged. And so maybe that speaks to this disconnect between central office support, Mcgee and LaShante notwithstanding, but this disconnect between what is happening at the school sites, what needs to happen with our educators, what are the things that we're going to put forth and provide so that they can get to this point of how do we produce equitable outcomes for kids, for our students and for our families. And the lack of representation in the decision-making spaces continues to be an issue. Now, of course, with the hiring of a new superintendent, That may or may not remain to be the case, because everything cannot fall upon one person. One person cannot undo hundreds of years of institutional practices that have marginalized and disenfranchised an entire race of people. And just to clarify something that Hatcher says, maybe just to go a little deeper around something. When we talk about race and equity, or the way that we have spoken about it in this year, those two terms as separate terms have been linked. We did not necessarily, or maybe like in reflecting back, maybe we should have had greater clarity around racial equity, but that is not initially how it was presented. Would you agree with that, right, Hatcher?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So we know that those are two very different things. So race and equity, two separate terms, and racial equity, they are not the same thing, and we do know that. So I just wanted to clarify for anyone who might be sitting and saying, what are they talking about? It is the same thing. It actually is not, but we do understand what the difference is, but that's not where our conversation in West Contra Costa Unified started, at least in my opinion. We started looking at two separate things.
And contemporaneous, I like being able to use my big words sometimes, with this whole idea of the racialized violence that happens in schools. People overlook the non-racialized violence that happens in schools that's even more so debilitating on students. And what I mean by that is we tend to look at people who are racist as somebody who's overtly racist, like those Black people are ends and they behave in a certain way and they all do the thing and they lack certain skills. But when the same conversation is torqued to where you say, hey, white people have magical powers, that conversation is accepted without any kind of like pushback. And what I mean by that is sometimes the people in positions to make the decisions don't know what to do, and yet we look to them like they should be making those decisions. And that's equally as debilitating as somebody in the classroom telling the kid that they can't do anything, they're never going to amount to anything, and they're never going to be anything, or whatever. And that was the language that we wanted to be able to out, right? If you don't know how to get something done, you shouldn't be in a position to make decisions for people who are grossly impacted by these things. And so I think at that, I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Christine and Michael. Just as a reminder, we will have time at the end of this presentation to entertain questions, to hear from other people. So just wanted to let folks know if they're like, I really need to ask some questions, there will be time for that. So as a result of the work that you saw here, we talked about the context, we talked about holding up our local mirror to see the work that we're doing. Want to also talk about supports, and this is as not the extensive list of supports, but so many supports that I think West Contra Costa did a good job of trying to offer this year, especially for their beginning pilot year. And so lobbing that over to Millie to discuss some of those.
So since this was the beginning pilot year, I think it's important for us to understand that typically this has to begin with education and sensitization, self-reflection, because you can't disrupt and dismantle that which you cannot identify. A group of district leaders, administrators had gotten together over the summer to start their own self-reflection process, then worked with Mr. Duffy and some of us to get things started. And that group realized very, very quickly that we needed the help of racial justice consultants. So in addition to me sticking my nose in, that is when Rachel and Chris joined the team. And we dedicated intentional time to this work. I want to call that out because as messy as things were, and they were messy, we did have time allocated. And the control of time is one of the ways you can either center work or decenter work. When we had to define what white supremacy culture is. So in our educational systems, sessions, we had to work on that. But that dedication of time was very, very significant, and it's also very much now at risk. We developed an equity strategic implementation team who's here today talking at you and with you and to you. With the support of our unions, we created the newly formed position of equity teacher leads who would work at their site with their principal to help craft and implement site-based initiatives. And strategic resources for principal supports. Michael Hatcher, Christine Hatcher, and I were all made ourselves available to provide one-on-one and small group technical support. We developed toolkits with slide decks, supplemental materials in response to our sites asking for content and more technical assistance. And in that, it was so important this year to establish some shared understandings that Michael Hatcher referred to. What is white supremacy culture? What are its characteristics? How does racism present in education? What was the initial racialized intent of American public education? What does it look like today? What are microaggressions? How are our students racially silenced? This all creates a context for action. And this was first year focus. We had bi-weekly training for our equity leads, leadership professional development training that is going on right now, and development and support of the curricula for the Friday session implementation. So each month, Michael Hatcher and Christine Hatcher developed all district videos and supports, and then we had the toolkits. So now we are faced with the threat. This cannot be a one and done. It cannot be the flavor of the month. And we do hear concerns about that. We can hear concerns about it being decentralized. So we're looking forward to strategy. If we start out thinking we have 2 hours to train some leaders, and those 2 hours are dwindled down to 30 minutes because of other priorities, this is how systems defend themselves. This is how systems can decentralize or decenter an initiative. So we're encouraged to be here. It was messy, but we're hoping to move forward.
Thanks, Ms. Burns.
Thank you so much, Millie. Just want to say that I have thoroughly enjoyed the wisdom that you have demonstrated during this time for my own growth and development. Not that I didn't get that from everyone, but certainly I got to hold out Miss Millie as the prime example of that. I want to also give a chance to a couple of our team members who haven't spoken yet. Lashante and Acedo, I didn't know if you want to speak before we go on to recommendations. Feel free to share about any of the things that we shared, our racial equity work context, our local mirror or supports, either of you.
Lashante can go before me.
No, I think everything that was said was accurate. Just happy to support the work. And today I'm a listener. I'm actually home with the newborn, so I'm just listening in.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank
I don't
you.
think I was aware of that.
No problem.
Oh my goodness. Okay, I won't derail this entire conversation since we're being recorded, but definitely.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. Okay, Acedo, would you like to just hop in here?
Okay, so Yeah, I agree with what has been shared before, but I just also would like to reiterate that this is a process. And this is something that cannot be solved by this year. So if you have incoming teachers to the district or teachers that are returning in the fall with the notion that, okay, so how's this all going to work? It's a little bit more deeper than that. So what we've done, Black Educator Network, is just getting a chance for Black educators to get together and just speak about what we're dealing with and how to deal with it, and not have the guys that just, having to do it during a staff meeting at our site. And it also gives the opportunity for us to talk amongst ourselves, those of us that are at different sites that usually don't interact with each other. So the main thing is for us to have discussions about racism in education and racism in our school systems, curriculum, and so on. Like, we have to have those conversations about what we're doing as well. And then once we start having these conversations, that's going to assist us and help us to even further address and assist our Black students in the district as well. Because that way, if I look at it this way, if we all band together, then that's actually something that can be demonstrated for Black students as well, that, okay, so they actually know each other, they have each other's back, so they would feel more invested. So I just say, we're just setting the table right now. This is going to take some time, and for folks to think that it's just going to be solved overnight, like Trustee Smith-Folds said earlier at the beginning of this, it's time to get uncomfortable. So next year, it'll be it's still going to be time to continue to get uncomfortable.
Thank you so much, Sato. I appreciate that, reminding us, number one, of the importance of groups of affinity, as well as reminding us that this is a long journey. As I like to say when I'm working with clients, I'm dope, but 3 months with me is not going to solve racism. So it's imperative that we understand the supreme journey that you are undertaking and how this is work. If it could have been solved by now, by just, 6 months of people getting in meetings together, I think we would have done it. So that lets you know how deeply entrenched this work is. And as Millie said, the way that systems move to self-correct is also deeply entrenched. And so being able to navigate those pieces. Chris and I are going to share, based upon this work this year, we're going to share some recommendations that we would offer, and then we'll have time to open up for questions and statement and public comment. So first and foremost, what we're not clear about is there or has there been a formal, clearly articulated public commitment to WCCUSD as an actively anti-racist organization? What I've seen are some notes around we want to work on equity, and I just got to say that equity, we define equity as the condition that would be achieved if race was not a predictor of outcomes for students, but also for adults, right? So it is difficult to get to equity without going through the tumultuous racial waters, right? So the notion of becoming anti-racist as an organization, which is different from going to equity, right? It's an additional step. We want to achieve equity. Chris and I believe that equity can be achieved if race isn't a predictor. So therefore, we're looking at how and the ways in which we can become an actively anti-racist organization. And the question is, have you had that conversation? And if you haven't had that conversation, then as the board director said, the time is now to get uncomfortable to say, is this what we're going to do? Right? Is this what we're doing? And if so, we need a clearly articulated public commitment that is on all of our platforms, so that when teachers come to WCCUSD, human resources is like, we are really working towards becoming actively anti-racist. Where are you in that? Right? So that's what we ask our leaders. You're coming to be a principal in WCCUSD, but we're looking for our school sites to be moving towards spaces that are actively anti-racist? Where are you in your commitment, right? When we hire people, all of those types of things, when we look at our policies and practices. So this notion of, are we gonna, are we doing it or are we not? Super, super important.
And I would echo one piece that we often, that I will say districts often miss is, do students see themselves not just reflected in the language of statements and infrastructures and whatnot? How do students feel supported when getting to school is a traumatic experience? How do students feel supported when leaving school is a traumatic experience? And then how do students feel supported when coming to school, in particular classrooms, are particularly traumatic, right? So where do students, particularly students of color, particularly Black and brown students, where do they see themselves not just being represented, but seeing somebody say, I see you, I see what you are navigating right now. I see that you are, right, within this, like, how do I actually survive? And our role and goal is to move you from that survivalism space into a place beyond survival. And that language that's not the everyday language that we use in policy documents. That's not the everyday language that we use in how we hire and evaluate and assess teacher effectiveness, leader effectiveness, and those sorts of things, right? So shifting to a, not just a student-centric, but a student survival and beyond centric language and conversation throughout and across support systems, right? And 1 through 5, we're framing essentially 1 out of conversation with a whole bunch of equity leads, predominantly, coming up with ideas and talking through barriers and frustrations. But 2, to get to number 6, so that we think about the entire, so racism is system, the entire system has to be anti-racist at every single level, and not just anti-racist because you have a teacher who does that thing there, but anti-racist because, right, we remove teachers who don't. Anti-racist because we remediate or have some sort of process or some sort of engagement with challenging teachers that promote racism, right? And it's not just like that's that one teacher over there that does it, right? But our curriculum, our expected pedagogy, the assessments, all the metrics that we use rooted within a context of racism, that means that we then have to look at and really have the obligation to look at, right, every single opportunity that we use to evaluate, to assess students, employees, is rooted in racism. That's a critical race theory lens. We presume that it is. Our role then is to, right, essentially look at every single piece. We can't do that if you don't resource the people who would do this work.
Yeah, so that was the way of just going through all of the recommendations. So yes, Chris, thank you so much. Like,
I mean, we can, people can
right,
read.
I'm not going to read them. We do want to highlight this notion of alignment about anti-Black racist behaviors, is that is something that, as Will said, that was where there was a huge outcry and a need for support. So anti-racism, and then underneath that, right, this notion of anti-Black racist behaviors and disrupting those. Expanding your investments, you see those there, and support systems. But the bottom line, as you said, is number 6, right? Our recommendation is that you continue to interrogate, identify, and dismantle. And this is what it takes to dismantle. So based upon that, I'm going to open this up for Q&A. There's our contact information. I'm not sure why that's there. Everybody knows how to contact us, but we're going to stop sharing. And I'm not sure what happens with public comment at this point. I'm going to turn this back over to Director Smith-Folds and Ruben, and you guys can tell us what we do.
We do board questions now.
Okay.
Then we'll go to public comments.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy, you are first.
Thank you, Chair Smith-Folds. I want to just start by thanking all of you for being here. This incredible conversation. It's hard going first, but also exciting to go first and asking questions. 'Cause I want to make obviously a lot of comments, but I think it's so critical that I continue to learn more from all of you. So I have a few maybe more detailed questions. First one, and both Dr. Canals, am I saying your last name right? Canals, okay. And Dr. Rogers Ard, did I say that correctly? Okay, thank you. Saying names correctly is important to me because my name's said wrong every day, so I know how that feels. So the first one, I want to like touch on the recommendations a lot later, but I want to learn a little bit more about the race and equity leads that were mentioned at the sites. Were those started already this year? And I was wondering what the role of those leads are currently and what the role and the vision is for them for next year and for future years.
I'll start. So we do have race equity leads, and I want to just clarify, because I know Christine mentioned them. They were initially were intended to be teachers. They were negotiated with UTR, but we do have race equity leads who are not teachers. So we do have some classified staff who are also serving as race equity leads. And there was a whole nomination process to get to the race equity lead and selection process. So they've been in place this year. I want to say they really onboarded around November, December, and they've been meeting consistently with Dr. Nelson, Dr. Rajazard, and the smaller team here. And then they've been holding in partnership with the site lead, and or if they have a race equity lead team or a ILT, that they're not the sole person responsible for the training, but we work in partnership with the administrative or team there. We are in the process of discussing this role for next year. As both trustees know, we're in the middle of negotiations with all our units, but we are looking at the race equity lead as a position that we'd want to bring back in some capacity next year. And that's just one of a few different positions like that we're looking at. I don't know if anybody else on the team wants to add. Millie?
Yeah, the challenge going forward is that they were identified and onboarded in November, at which time the initiative was already underway. The selection process differed in many schools, as did their relationship to the crafting and presentation of sessions. But from my perspective, the biggest challenge was we did not have time to adequately train them to provide for their professional development. And with the reopening of schools, the loss of time being allocated to this initiative, we face a very real challenge on how we provide their professional development, how we teach them how to facilitate, and how we provide them with the ongoing content and technical assistance needed for the success at each site.
I think one thing that we heard from them as we surveyed the equity leads was that the role, while conceptually was, definitely fairly fully baked, the way that it was implemented at each school site was vastly different depending upon how comfortable the site lead felt in leading racial equity work. So if there was a site lead was like, yes, I'm all in, then the equity lead felt like, yeah, we can move together as a partner. But in the instances where the site lead did not feel comfortable, it was sort of left up to the equity lead, who then often did not have the institutional pull to really lead the work well. In other words, it became a barrier. So to Millie's point, right, if we're going to have equity leads, making sure that their role is well documented and conceptualized with the site leads who did not have the time to really receive the additional training. And the feedback that we heard from site leads is some felt comfortable leading that work and some did not, which raises quite, very interesting things systemically about a district that has said, yes, we want to do racial equity work, but our site leads may or may not feel comfortable about that. That's a whole nother topic of conversation. So where the site leads were comfortable, our understanding is things were moving along rather rapidly, but there has to be a partnership there. And if the site lead didn't feel comfortable or that they had the skill set, to Millie's point, there was not enough time to train the site leads in conjunction with the equity leads.
But Rachel, would you say it's fair to say that having site leads, and we mean principals, administrators who are not comfortable, is fairly typical? And it's indicative
Absolutely.
it's indicative of how deeply systemic racism is ingrained in our system.
Absolutely. I'm sorry.
So some can retire.
Please do not. I thank you, Millie. I did not mean to in any way suggest that West Contra Costa is somehow different than every other school district that I'm working in. We don't ask. So to our point about a recommendation, number one, it doesn't awfully happen, right? We don't say, look, this is what we're looking for. What we say is we need a great leader who, understands children and wants to create, which is all wonderful. But maybe what we're not asking is, what's your stance on being an anti-racist leader, and how do you create anti-racist classrooms, and how do you support teachers towards, maybe that's not part of what we say we're looking for. So then when we don't get that, we cannot be surprised.
And I think it's important to differentiate culturally responsive teaching here from anti-racist teaching. Often what the default becomes, well, let's at least try to do culturally responsive teaching. Yes, also, that's not necessarily anti-racist teaching, right? So most districts default to a conception. I think this reflects Michael Hatcher's points around terminologies. If we're not actually using clear terminologies, most definitions of implementations of culturally responsive teaching is teaching to the population you have. It's not necessarily teaching anti-racism to the population that you have.
Thank you, everybody, for that. I mean, this just speaks about how complex this issue is, right? I mean, asking about equity leads led us all the way to what Dr. Nosh just mentioned, right? So I wanted to actually go back a tiny bit, and I think that Principal Hatcher mentioned the surveillance of students of color in our schools. And I was wondering if you all could define a little bit deeper for me and for people who are watching, what that looks like in our schools for students of color, and how we, especially after last year of work, how you all see that we are still doing that in our schools. I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, thank you.
I think Chris has something. I won't want to speak for Chris, but I'll do this one. So the over surveillance of students in schools. I mean, if you look at research, a simple answer would be, you would see that if you track eye movements, teachers tend to watch Black students more than any other group of students in the classroom. When they walk and use proximity, they tend to stand closer or farther away from, depending on who you talk to, of the Black students. Moreover, if you look at instructional strategies and you think about surveillance as the lack of privacy, that Black students can't have any privacy, then less higher order questions are asked, right? Because there's no information you have that really needs to tickle my fancy. I just need superficial information to come from you. And you will also see more direct instruction. So there won't be as much Socratic seminar. You won't see as much inquiry based. You won't see as much people trying to, there's knowledge, skill, and reasoning targets. You won't see as many reasoning targets being directed in the classroom, even in science classrooms. I've gone to science classrooms where a bunch of Black and Latino students, and it was all direct instruction. And I was like, have you done an experiment this year? And the teacher was like, no. And the kids were like, no, we just sit here and listen to him talk for 40 minutes. I hope that answers your question, but those are a couple of just some concrete examples of things you would see if you're looking for surveillance in the classroom.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And I know we're asking questions, Chair Smith-Folds, but I just want to context. I mean, we obviously talk about this in a national level, right? And a lot of the issues that we hear nationally are probably happening in our district, right? But I constantly trying to find out what is it that we're seeing that we do need to work on, right? So that was really important for me to hear. I mean, Trustee Smith-Folds 2 weeks ago mentioned how in our own district Facebook page, we posted a picture of celebrating the return to in-person instruction. And in the picture, you see all the Black students sitting in the back and no student of color sitting in the front, right? And I mean, I think that obviously it's a part of that, right? So I want to hear obviously more details about how the challenges that we got to work through in our own district, but I know obviously a lot of them are what, like Dr. Rogers already said, what she sees in every district. But I think that we obviously need to name them so that then we can actually work on them. And I see Mr. Mcgee, you have your hand, go ahead.
Yeah, cool. No, thank you. And I think I heard your question in there, right? But that does underscore what I believe this conversation is, right? Because we do have some highly effective teachers. We have some highly effective administrators who are interested in making the change. But I think that we have to provide the catalyst, Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy. And what I mean by that is, as you mentioned that picture, what's happening is that some of our parents, especially our Black parents and guardians, are saying, well, my child's not going to go back to the hub in person because what they're doing during the school day, they can just do at home. And so that's where, if I understand your question, we do have to begin the out of the box thinking. We have to figure out how we can really engage with our Black children. And as the adage goes, if you can get a Black student to become successful through teaching and learning strategies, it'll benefit any child. And so, yeah, that picture unfortunately does echo what is happening, but then it also shows the change that we need. And that's where the race and equity discussion comes into play. I believe coupling that with our race and equity leads, and then our site leaders and the training, and then just not the site leaders, also the department leaders, because we're an institution that's in the business of educating children, and we cannot just state that it's at the site level. This is a systems-wide change that's needed, and respectfully, from the school board level on down, whereas when you all start to engage in that level of discourse, then we'll start to see the seriousness of it, and then that level of discourse will then trickle down to the central office, which will then get to the school sites, which will get to our parents and guardians. So I think, again, like I said, and I apologize for rambling, but your question, or what I think I may have heard, is this does underscore the sentiment that we need to make the change. And the last thing that I'll say is, through Director Christy Rosigno's department, the English literature, the English learner and early literacy, and then with OASA, we were actually able to bring teachers and parents and guardians together to look at instructional materials that show Black children in a positive way, not only for those Black children, but then for other children in the classroom to see them in a positive way. So I think I'll wrap up with that is we do need to do the training to re-envision and reimagine what school can look like.
Thank you, Director Mcgee. That was perfect. And it kind of ties to my next question, which is, how do you all see the role of the board playing in this conversation on race and equity? And to go a little deeper, just an example, board members never got, and that's our own fault for never asking, but we never got invitations for the trainings this year, right? But what does that look, what does that speak to? That the board, who's supposed to be setting policy and direction at the highest level in this organization, is not getting the same training as people at the sites. And that's just, I'm constantly concerned, right? That we're not setting the example of what these conversations should look like at every school. Anyways, now I'm rambling, Director Mcgee, but you really sparked that on me because I completely agree with what you said. And I just want to hear from all of you, like, what is our role as a whole, as a body, but then individually to play in this fight against racism and in the fight for race and equity?
So I'm going to push back a bit and say the board has held quite a few study sessions this year for, as we were working on and trying to open schools. It's about priorities. I mean, we haven't prioritized as a board the race equity work. Yes, the board approved a contract and the board, gave us this direct direction, but the board hasn't asked for that to come back in that capacity. So my push is, as two of the board members here, you have that power to say, we want this at our next board meeting, at our study, or we can make a study session, or however you want to approach it. I think that's there and that's possible. And I will say we can invite, obviously, board members to things. I know that Trustee Smith-Folds attended the first of the Leading with Racism, and there was an invitation out. I'm not sure Gonzalez, if you saw that, but we could definitely open that up again because there's 2 more sessions for that training. But I would say if this is the will of the board, we have no problem bringing that to the board.
I want to also make it clear that in our original proposal, because I'm all about leadership and I've watched initiatives come and go, and it's really up to those who are holding leadership, particularly at the site and the central office, to move it forward even when senior leadership leaves. So part of our original proposal, myself and Chris, was we had to have a board session and we had to meet with the board, especially after what I would term a rather contentious meeting with the previous board to approve the contract in December of last year. So even after we had already included that in the proposal, and then we went back and said, oh no, after that, like serious late night evening that it will always remain in my memory, it is imperative, even more so, that we get in front of board. But again, the response was, we have all these other things to do, which, first of all, let me just acknowledge, you're in multiple pandemics with reopening and not knowing what's happening. So I acknowledge that this was not a regular year, but I agree with you wholeheartedly. Board sets tone, board sets direction. And then, and then we're to implement some of those pieces. So if we, as a district, are saying, yes, anti-racism is definitely important, board absolutely needs to have that understanding. Number one, for training so that we're all hearing the same thing, to go back to Michael Hatcher, right? That the terms that we're using are all consistent across, the entire school district. But then number two, so that when parents come to you and your constituents and community members, that you can speak well about the work that's moving forward as well, right? So that's imperative. I would strongly urge that. In fact, and while I have the mic, in addition to the board, I also ask for senior leadership team, right? So whatever is your cabinet or whatever you're thinking about that, because that provides direction. So it can't just be the chief academic officer is holding racial equity. That's not how that works, right? It has to be, I think, as Will said, across senior leadership, but then it goes to the sites within, right? And what you have is a disconnect. And this is not just West Contra Costa, so I'm not dumping on WCCUSD. But what often happens with this type of work is a disconnect from the leadership at central office level and the board, and what's happening closer to students, right? Because the closer you get to students, the more often you are seeing some of the things that we were talking about before, like, the data that shows that we don't see our African-American students, or the data that also shows if African-American students ask a question, as you said, Will, it's considered defiance versus curiosity, right? So we see that more easily the closer we are to students, but 110% the need for leaders and board members to also receive this training.
And to put it further, we at one point wanted a retreat, a board retreat, because we have to make sure, as Michael Hatcher continually reminds us, that we're speaking a common language, that our board knows what white supremacy culture looks like, acts like, sounds like, and manifests in education. Policy is the domain of the board. Once we understand that, then every single policy in this district needs review from an anti-racist lens. Okay? That cannot happen, though, if board members don't have that deep but practical understanding of how racism presents in education. We have yet to really look at behavior management and discipline policies. We have yet to really look at curriculum. We have yet to really look at hiring practices. Why do we have schools serving special education students with maybe one Black staff, one Black teacher? Schools that are predominantly Black and brown, but do not have a predominantly Black and brown workforce? Why do we lose teachers who are Black and brown? Are you satisfied with us teaching to a test? Are you satisfied with us assessing progress in teachers based on a racialized process that has been identified and known for years? So we made the offer. There's a breakdown in making it happen and accessing board members. And I'm the one that always gets in trouble, so that's okay.
Thank you, Millie. I appreciate that, and all of you for saying everything you said. I mean, I completely agree, and I'm soon going to turn it over to Chair Smith-Folds because I know I'm going a lot, but I completely agree, and I think that constantly people believe that because the newly elected board is mostly people of color, majority people of color, that we are well versed and trained and understand race and equity. I constantly get the comments of like, are you speaking on behalf of all Latinos because you're the only Latino on the board? And I come with a lot of privilege and a lot of misunderstandings of race and equity. And I see it lacking in a lot of the decisions sometimes we make. Now we're 3 months in, feels 3 years in, but so we still have obviously a lot of time to continue to develop that and train it and understand. But maybe that's one of some of the recommendations that can come out today from us to the full board that we can continue to work on. So thank you so much for responding to that. My next question, maybe this one I'll send to Mr. Sato, Mr. Sato, because you talked about staff voice. How can, in your opinion, how can we work, and anyone obviously welcome to jump in too, how can we continue to work to increase the voice of staff of color in WCCUSD?
Well, I think the first thing that needs to be established is just eliminate and just the fear of advocating for someone else. So I'm the type of person, I'm going to call it for what it is when I see it. And I know a lot of my colleagues are the same, but when you're a first year teacher, if you're a second year teacher, if you're a teacher that may not have the greatest relationship with your staff, may have the greatest relationship with your admin, or something happened on district, there may be some fear behind that. But I think it's just the fact that I think like this year was important because a lot of people spoke up. And part of that is when Black and brown educators may speak up at a staff meeting, there's going to be that pushback of like, oh, well, it's not that bad. Like that didn't happen. Or like, like, are you sure that happened? Or they don't, that type of things, like the disbelief of what's really happened, or it may not be addressed, or, you may want to discuss a certain item on the agenda and then it gets brushed aside for something else altogether different. So I think it's just the fact that speaking out on this, is going to be, just the pushback between it, because it happened, it can happen amongst like, staff against staff, like parents against staff, like staff against members of the district, employees of the district, and so on. So I think it's just really just hone into that piece that, when you have norms and you say everyone speaks their truth, you have to accept the fact that everyone's going to speak their truth. The norm is not everyone speak the truth, but if I don't like it, I'm going to get an attitude, or I'm going to shut down, or I'm going to dismiss it even. So I think that's the big thing, is just how to set up when, like, okay, let's just go ahead and have the conversation and not feel that there's any repercussions or pushback on it.
Traditionally, what we know is that race and power are linked, right? We understand that there could be race, but the way that we have in our country created white supremacist systems is that there's a link with power, and power has created laws, and that's why we have systems that move to self-correct. When you have folks of color who are experiencing microaggressions, who are experiencing racial aggressions and what have you, and they do speak, there is often a pushback. And that pushback is very negative and could be, as Sato indicated, it could be anything from, no, that doesn't happen, to, oh, that wasn't race, what are you talking about? So we call that race lighting, where we are saying something and then the person who is often saying, no, I think that was something racial, is being told so frequently that it wasn't racial that the person starts to think, well, maybe it really wasn't racial, but really it was. And so what we have to do is create a culture that takes us from white fragility to white accountability, where we allow folks to say, you know what, we're going to stop saying to folks of color, particularly Black people, oh, that wasn't racist, you crazy, that wasn't what that was. So we have to agree to create that type of culture. And that comes frankly through time and shifting our cultural response. And then as a result, we have to then teach folks to say, you know what, I didn't mean for it to land that way, but I could see where that can come off like that. And what do I need to do differently, right? And then that's the accountability piece around, wow, this is really still happening. And it's difficult, right? It's difficult for people who feel like they're well-meaning individuals. This is what Robin DiAngelo talks about as the good, bad binary, that suddenly we're not saying you're a bad person. We're saying this happened. We want you to believe it happened so we can make things better for students. And when white folks particularly, but people who are in power also who may not be white, refuse to take accountability for some of the actions that folks are calling out, then what happens? You don't want to call them out anymore. And then often you are, labeled, right? You're playing the race card, or, oh, you're angry, or any of the other stereotypical things. And then that then silences. So what we have is, right, this system that is repetitive at best. So it's about creating that culture. And so when I think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging initiatives, the belonging piece is the one where we start to shift culture so that when particularly Black voices, Black students and adults are saying things that they are believed that they're safe, that there's an opportunity for them to say them so that we can make change. Not so we can, right? This is not a shame blame game. It's a, we want to do things better for our students. And that means that we have to shift culture.
One of the most difficult cultural shifts I've observed in education, has to do with to what extent are we going to tolerate demonstrably racist behavior of teachers and staff? At what point do we shift? Because right now we have contracts, we have customs, we have HR policies, all sorts of things that mean we have no recourse. That's a very tough cultural shift. That involves our unions, union contracts, HR policies. But it happens too often. And we all have, those of us who've been around the district court, we've got those horror stories. Think about it.
I do just want to add one little thing, and there's a difference between overt racism and covert racism, right? So overt white supremacy are the things that we see that we all agree are horrible. Swastikas, other things that happen in our school districts. And we're like, oh no, those are horrible. But there's a whole list of covert actions, covert white supremacy actions that are happening every day, to Millie's point. We have to first name them and examine them and then agree as a system that we're going to work to dismantle. So I'm sorry, I couldn't let that go.
Yeah,
No,
that's why I said demonstrable.
Thank you. Thank you for saying all that. I'll make this my last question so that Trustee Smith-Foltz can also have plenty of time. And Trustee Smith-Foltz willing to extend tonight, as long as you need me to, as long as people are able to stay. I also want to respect people's time, but I'm really concerned about, I've been really amazed of the work that's happened this year, but to some extent, the pandemic has given us silver lining, which is time, which we've never had before. My concern is what's going to happen in the next few years, that we don't have those Fridays, we don't have that time. Have you all had a conversation? Maybe this is more for Mr. Aurelio and maybe Mr. Mcgee, but anyone's welcome to jump in. How can we continue to do this work knowing that one of our biggest detriments to really doing this work right is time? And most likely that might not change because of our budgetary situation. How can we push back on that and still continue to be in this effort?
So one, I would say priorities. We have to prioritize the professional learning, adult learning time that we do have. And obviously I can't, as of right now, we know we're in negotiations, we're going through that whole process and even negotiating what fall would look like. So without going into any real details about that, but I think there could be a priority as we negotiate fall and we talk about professional learning and we talk about the time that in space for that learning, we, in the back of our minds, we should be thinking, okay, we got to fit this, this, and this in, whatever those three things might are, race, equity, you have to prioritize your list and have that in place. So when you do have those conversations with the different bargaining units, there's some alignment to that time being there. Because if the alignment's not there, and from both the district side and the union side, you're going to have that disconnect, and you now have to give up certain things. We know the budget's going to be tight. We know that releasing whole staff or schools to do this work would be a heavy lift to get that done. So you're right. The change in the Friday structure, it was a gift this year. I mean, it truly was a gift to have that time. But we also have to be strategic in how we approach it. So this year, as we all said, it was messy. We started one way, changed mid-year and changed things out. So learning from that, we can begin to develop a plan that's really strategic and has a strong scope and sequence, has a process. If it's starting with leadership, pick and choose where exactly you want to begin that work to continue. And Will, I see that you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I would just add that just because the distance learning may not look the same next year, we still do have time, Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy. And what I mean by that is there are the professional development or collaboration meetings that happen at the sites. So if we can figure out how to incorporate race and equity, racism in education into all of our meetings, and what I mean by that is that Ruben will also tell you, I've been in meetings where I'm like, Ruben, why are we talking about this over here when as an organization, we're saying this and our school sites are not connected? So I think I would just say that there is opportunity. And then it goes back to how we do support our site and department leaders to make them become more proficient in this type of discourse. And then we have to have honesty with all of our stakeholders. And what I mean by that is, just as I learned as a teacher, I used to always say yes, and my students clown me. They're like, it's okay to tell us no. And so that's what we have to also talk with our stakeholders about and be honest with them. But then we also need to bring our parents and guardians into this discussion. So that way it can be a holistic approach, and not just with our school site employees, but we're bringing in parents and guardians and then students into the conversation. So I think I would just say that there is still opportunity for this work to continue. It's up to the board and the superintendent to say, is this the work we want to do? So that's what I would say.
And I would say, could I add to, the policy work needs to continue as well. I mean, that, yes, we need time to train people, but we also can make some systemic shifts by looking at the policies. Rochelle, I think you were about to unmute.
Yes, when I do this work with other school districts, I ask this question: where is the biggest bang for your buck this year? Right? So you did have a blessed year this year where you were able to be like, we're going to train everybody. But what we lost was fidelity of training, and we lost the ability to really get to our site leads because of all the different pieces, right? So if you have a limited amount of resources, but you're like, we want to learn from our lessons from year one pilot year, one recommendation might be double down on your efforts with your equity leads, right? That was a continuous group that, while they did not get all the training we wanted because of the way it was set up, perhaps there's ways to systemically set them up for success with not just the training, but also on their sites, that they know that they are the ones who are doing that they're responsible, and the principals who are maybe not being trained are going to be able to offer more support and fewer barriers, right? So like, if that's the biggest bang for your buck, and then you can have a couple of things, a couple of sessions when you have those release days for other groups, and that's what you do systemically, then you do that, right? We don't let good be the opposite of excellent. What we have to say is, where do we go, right? If we're trying to get to parents and to stakeholders, that means how do we create some community engagement pieces across the year? Maybe there's 4 of those, right? Where you do those. I think it's about strategic planning. And I don't mean to in any way trivialize any of the planning that happened before, but I think you want to make the decision, is this the work you want to do? And if so, here's the container. We can only do what we can only do. Here's the best way for us to do that. And then let's back map it and do that work so that like you hit the ground running, and it's aligned, and it allows for some on-ramps from some other groups. That would be my recommendation.
So I want to just real quick jump into, and while there's strategies that are concretely naming anti-racism, investing in equity leads as a conversation, should there be any meeting, effort, movement, thing happening in the district that isn't anti-racist? And why I ask that is, until there's an actual norming of any conversation that is happening as a officially sanctioned district school site conversation, has to center a lens of who is this impacting? How am I disrupting ongoing racist impacts that are specifically target, right, African-American, Black, Latino communities? And if we're not having that lens in each and every meeting, we can also do these other things that we're advocating, right, as concrete investments in specific people to resource them so that their influence grows within that context. But if we don't normalize every single meeting, every single conversation, every single decision-making process, every single essentially accountability metric with an anti-racist lens, what we end up doing is asking, for example, equity leads to address the racism of other folks that don't have to do it, right?
Thank you so much, everybody, for that answer. I'll pass it back to Chair Smith-Folds. I don't have any further questions.
Thank you so much, Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy. There was a Q&A question. Mr. Aurelio, it says,
Yes.
Ms. Burns said that the equity leads were poorly trained this year. If their position remains, what is the plan to improve their training?
Ms. Burns, do you want to speak to because I think you had said that they were poorly trained. Do you want to speak to what you meant by that process, or?
Right. I mean, I probably wouldn't phrase it as poorly because that's a qualitative assessment. We started and kicked off the initiative in September. We onboarded the equity leads in November. So they were brought on to an existing active initiative. We had no assessment of their knowledge of content, their skill in terms of facilitating. There's a huge difference between teaching and facilitating this sort of thing, but it was ongoing. So they had to just jump in there and do it. We all acknowledge that's not the best way. So now we're looking at how do we carve out the time to really provide them with that baseline of professional development and then the ongoing technical assistance throughout the year. And I can give you an example. Maybe we can find some time and a little bit of money, 5 days of professional development on content and facilitation skills, and then each month orient them to the scope of work, the sequence, and the materials that they have available to them for that month. It takes planning, but it does not sound that we could not do that.
Thank you so much. Actually, I think all of you guys answered the questions that I had in your presentation and in the conversation, but just some of the questions I had, and Ms. Burns just spoke to it. It was, how are we scaffolding and differentiating the instruction that we give in these larger meetings? Because someone comes in, there may be, if we have the race and equity leads there, if we have the site administrators there, if we have whoever there, there's different levels that people come in with an understanding of race. Do you know what I mean? And a different level of experience and exposure that they have to race. So you guys are kind of talking to me about this, and Ms. Burns is saying we got to have the time. We have to invest the time. It has to be, and Mr. Aurelio saying it has to be prioritized. The board has to take it on as making sure that it is prioritizing the policy that goes along with this. And not only are we not only having policy, but that policy has to be centered. I did hear you talk about colonial education system, which I was happy to hear an explanation about that. That was one of my questions. Because people look at you like you're a unicorn, like in like a cyclops. When you say colonial education system, they get mighty offended. Like, I don't know, they're a pilgrim, but they get mighty offended when you say colonial education system, and it's just facts. It's facts. It's a colonial education system. I am looking for the strategies, the tips, the flags on the play when you guys are not here that our district's left with, when they can say, whoop, nope, we're going to the left, we got to center back. We have to center back on not just race and equity, but racial equity. So we have to bring it back center. So I also want to talk to the fact about how have we empowered WCCUSD to dismantle racism? I think a lot of what WCCUSD does is it gives the title without the power. You just throw people titles out, but you don't give them the power to actually do anything with that. And it's just a box checking. So I want to make sure that race and equity is not just something that we continue to just check boxes off, like, see, look at us, we have a resolution, or look at us, we have an office, or look at us, we have this, but we give those people the power to actually make some change. Again, pretend these are questions that I had, but you guys have already answered. But Ms. Burns, we're talking about the time that we need. I am curious about, did you see every school represented in these meetings that we had? And if you did not, speak to that.
So I was speaking around race equity leads and department leads. I will say initially, I think every school for the most part, including some departments, were represented, because we also have some department leads. As the year progressed, there was some shifts and some changes, which speaks to, honestly, the messiness of this work, where there was some shifts and changes where some race equity leads either dropped out or stopped the engagement piece. But for the most part, they were all represented in the work. And then we shifted partway through the year as well. And we started to invite, with the race equity leads, the site leaders to those trainings as well. Now, they were not represented 100% at those meetings, but it was an invitation, not a mandate, that they attend. And so you had definitely some sites that included their site leader with their race equity leads, which allowed for a different conversation to happen and more planning to happen in those sessions.
So I think that leads to the fact that, Mr. Rayla, when I'm invited to a party that I know I'm going to enjoy, I show up. But if some people are invited to this party and they don't think they're going to enjoy it, they may just kind of skip out a little bit. That's talking to that idea of what we were talking about. Uncomfortability has to be a requirement in this work. If you don't feel uncomfortable, we're not working hard enough, and neither are you. You're not reflecting enough, because you should feel uncomfortable in this. This work should make you want to think, make you want to have a conversation, make you want to self-reflect. So I think that we need to stop asking and start telling. We tell a lot of, I know I had to have my TB shot before I went back to teaching. Like y'all told me, you got to have a TB shot before you come up here and around these kids. So we need to start telling them that you're going to have to do some race and equity work before you come around these children, before you enter this building. I think that's what everybody was saying about set a standard. set a standard that this is what is going to have to be in this district. And I think that was the first recommendation, which Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy, it leads to what Mr. Wilson made a phone call about last Wednesday or Wednesday before our board meeting, saying, hey, we need affirmative statement. We need a affirmative statement from the board saying this is who we are and this is who we are not, and this is what we stand for and this is what we don't stand for. So I really want us to push that forward, that we have to set the standard. Like, if we're not going to say it, how do we expect teachers to implement it? How do we expect sites to talk about it? How do we expect any accountability if a majority Black and brown board won't say it? Do you know what I mean? Like, if we walk in fear, then everybody gonna be scared. So I think that's something that we need to kind of push forward. I didn't really ask any questions, sorry. Those are more just kind of like what I heard, like what I captured. I would like us to start, anyone in the audience, if you want to make a public comment, this is the time to pop your hand up. No, don't freak out. It's not like if you pop your hand up in a minute, we're not going to let you do it. Like, please, this is where we are as a committee. We let people speak. We don't silence. Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy, you want to extend? You want to go ahead and extend?
Yeah, thank you, Trustee Smith-Foltz. If it's okay, could we extend maybe 15 minutes? I don't want to make too many comments, but I do want to make sure we leave with some recommendations that we can move forward to the rest of the board. Do you think that 15 minutes will be enough? Maybe 6:15, or should we just say 6:30 to be sure? I know Mr. Early has to leave.
Oh, you have to go, Mr.
I'm okay. There's no class tonight. I'm okay.
Oh, great. Okay, so go ahead, Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy. What time you want?
6:30 is fine. Then I'll make a motion to extend till 6:30 if you're okay with that.
I am. So I second that. Seeing no dissension, we will extend to 6:30. And this is our first, not our last conversation in academic committee. So please know that this is a commitment of academic committee. All right, let's hit it.
So we'll go to Farnaz. Farnaz, you can unmute.
Good afternoon, board members and staff. First and foremost, I want to appreciate every one of you, because the venues that I've been attending with Trustee Smith-Foltz and Gonzalez-Hoy have been the most transparent, and they lead as an example to our systems. As an employee who's going to be going into my 29th year in the district, I am very hopeful of the change that we would make as a team. And I'm calling it a team because at Grant, I lead my staff as part of a team. There was a lot that was mentioned in regard to how our equity leads didn't receive the training they needed. Then we talked about bargaining units. And this is a discussion we've had year after year after year after year. And this topic comes with a lot of emotion for me, because sometimes my teachers don't realize what their behaviors are and how they affect young children of color. I have 31 African-American students. I have 92% English learner, immigrant, Latinx students. And then I have children that are of different demographics. That should not define what my school does. It should not define how my students are treated. However, often they are treated that way because of their zip code. Not too long ago, we had a board member visiting. It was prior to COVID. My teachers were talking about a child who was having a meltdown in our staff room. That child was pushed to his limits. And as part of triage, both my vice principal and I were called to assist him while he was having I want to call it a mental health crisis, because that's where he was pushed. And if it wasn't because of my Playworks coach, my classified personnel, myself and my VP being trained in trauma-informed practices, we would not have been able to manage the situation. Our esteemed board member just sat in our staff room while my staff proceeded to talk very negatively of this student, how his guardians, caregivers don't take care of him, how his caregivers don't know what to do with him, so he's our problem most of the day. That is not who I want to lead. I want to lead teachers who have an open eye and are taking the staff training that I provide to them on staff, at our professional development, and internalize it enough that they're not bad-mouthing an 8-year-old child, where they're encouraging the board member to tell me as a site leader to call the police because this kid's off the hook every day. This is just one of the instances. Of course, our board member was listening to everything. And I don't, at that moment, I didn't know where their mindset was. However, I will say this to you. I was not going to let the board member leave my campus until he hears my side of it. When board members come to our campus, they need to do the walk. It shouldn't be an hour, it shouldn't be 20 minutes. They need to start the day when the kids arrive, and they should work alongside a teacher and administrator and see what happens on a daily basis. When the board member was trying to exit very swiftly, I said, oh, no. You need to come and we need to have a very open conversation. I'm an immigrant in this community. I came when I was 11 years old. I'm a second language learner. When you look at me, I'm white as can be, but I don't identify as white. That's not my experience. Yes, I grew up with a silver spoon in my mouth, but I know the immigrant life. I know how this child is feeling because I've been to his house. I know what's going on. He's been into 15 foster cares, and a great grandma who was taking care of him just passed away a month ago, and he found her. Can I say all that to my staff without UTR reps on my site filing a grievance? Are we bringing people into our system who are getting trained efficiently before they go and present themselves to our most vulnerable groups? We talk about how our schools are not representative. I have yet to find representation of people of color coming through my HR. If it wasn't for Teach for America, I would not have children of color saying, educators of color. If it wasn't because my own children are young and resilient and advocates for everyone, I would not know young folks to recruit. Had I not been a teacher in the district who's still in touch with children I taught 28 years ago at Olinda, who are all professionals, who are doing great things, I would not know to recruit them to teach at my school. So, we talk is cheap. I'm going to say that. At this point in my career, I need to speak up. I can't go back to the same old, same old. Our board needs to do the talk. They need to do the walk. I'll bring up something else. We've had trauma-informed practices at our site. We've had conflict resolution. Anyway, I want to wrap it up. We need to make professional development a priority. I'm looking at a bell schedule. I think we, as site administrators, shouldn't have to create MOUs. We should go with a 4-day schedule in the entire district and dedicate Fridays to professional development. The best thing that happened to my site was when my custodians were in the same Zoom call as every other staff member. And little by little, the custodians were pulled away. This person was pulled away. And then what did we have? A shell of a training. My site lead and I attended every session with Dr. Rogers and I apologize, Chris, I remember his first name. Those were the most beneficial professional developments I've had in years. When we came back to the site, my site lead spoke eloquently. It was because she could say it and I couldn't. And I find that a lot of our administrators gag themselves because they are worried that UTR, I will say it, I'm sorry, I have to say it, or Teamsters will look at them in a negative light. But why are we here? Are we here for the kids? It certainly is not for the pay. If we're here for the kids, we need to find solutions at the central office through the board. That's how we get things done. Because I'm tired of jumping on bandwagons and getting no results. So I apologize. I took more time than I should, but thank you for this wonderful opportunity. Let's not water it down any more than we already have since August, September.
So we have one more hand raised. Jamil, I'm going to say Sale, but I'm not sure if I'm messing up your last name, so I apologize.
No problem. My name is Jamil Sahali. I'm a parent in the district. I want to say thank you for facilitating the conversation. Seems like there's a lot of work to be done. My concern is that years later, I'll still ask the question of what are we teaching for Black history in grade 3 or grade 2 or grade 5? And the answer will still be, we're working on that. We're still trying to figure that out. I'm not sure how you train people to be effective in a subject that they don't know about without teaching them the subject. We can't hold teachers responsible to teach Black history that they don't know. So I appreciate all of the work policy-wise, but until it's in the classroom, curriculum-wise, it seems like there's a disconnect. I don't want to say that these other ends shouldn't be happening, but this seems, I sit on the school site council. Professional development is a large chunk of money every year. Seems kind of bottomless. It's never ending. To propose that we're going to go to 4 days a week to train people, what level of training do we need every single year to provide a staff that we've had for decades? At some point, it doesn't even make sense. And so please continue to work, but let's work towards the progress of what the children are taught. Thank you.
Thank you. So I don't know what happened to C. Peters. I don't see them on the call anymore. So if they come back, hopefully they'll raise their hand because they're, oh, where am I? Okay. Is it a phone number? That is really bizarre. Does
Mr. Aurelio, I don't see her or him either.
I know that's what I'm trying, because I see in the comments in the chat, it shows she is here. Is this Carol Peters, I think?
Yes.
Ms.
Yeah,
Peters, could you try raising your hand?
Because we can't see you anywhere on the call. That's so weird. You're in some weird Zoom limbo right now. Where oh wait, there it is. Wait, nope.
Oh,
that's Mr. Cooper.
Okay.
Maybe she could put her comments on the chat so that at least we can capture what she wanted to say, if that's okay.
Yeah, we can go to Mr. Cooper now, and Miss Peters, if you want to maybe try log back in to see if I can, because I can't see your name on the participant list. All right, Mr. Cooper, you can unmute.
Yes, I just want to echo what the gentleman, the parent, just said earlier about how are we going to move to changing what takes place in the classroom. I don't think his point was answered, and I really would appreciate someone addressing it because that's a key point. How are we going to teach our kids so that they're the best that they can be? And we need to get away from just the aspirational to actually implementation. So if someone could speak to that gentleman's question, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Mr. Aurelio, I see Ms. Peters and Mr. Cooper. We will speak to that. Let's get Ms. Peters' question in, and then we will go right to that if we can. Those on the panel, we heard Mr. Jamil's question and Mr. Cooper's question. If we could speak to that, that would be very helpful. I do see Ms. Peters, so Mr. Aurelio, do you see Ms. Peters?
I do. Ms. Peters, now it looks like you can unmute. And thank you, Mr. Cooper, for yours.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to quickly address a couple of things. I was a race and equity lead for my campus, and the job was very hard in that when the information came out for the position, it was there was a section called "You are a lead learner," and it really stressed the importance that you're a lead learner and you're not an expert. So I really embrace that idea that I'm learning and I do not know anything or do not know enough where I feel comfortable even creating professional development. But luckily on our campus, we had a climate team that really we all worked together to really create these PDs. And I think that was very important for me to have support, but also just as we are curating an experience for the teachers, it's not just my level of expertise, but realizing that everyone's not on the same page and everyone's not in the same position as far as staff, and understanding what anti-racism looks like and how to even begin reflecting in that and growing to become anti-racist. And I think I was disappointed when I attended the trainings that it didn't give me any kind of real tools to bring back to my campus to address where we were in our need. And I really didn't use a lot of it on our campus. What I did find very helpful were the trainings that the district provided with Christine Hatcher, Mr. and Mrs. Hatcher. I found those great when we got them ahead of time. Unfortunately, we received a lot of those again Thursday before the training on Friday, and we had already established, we already created our training for Friday because we wanted to be prepared. So that was an issue I had as well. But when they did come, in time and we were able to use them the following week, I thought that was very helpful. I think I agree with the principal from Grant that it was great to have all staff members present for these trainings, because we have to realize that every single person impacts the students' experience on campus. And it's not just teachers in the classroom, it's not just the aides that are in the classroom, but from the office staff to the janitors, everyone who is on campus impacts the learning environment of the student. And they all need to be there so they can hear that what they are doing and how they might be behaving can have a huge impact on the student. And I think that was one of the benefits of having these Friday trainings. And I would like to see that continue. I mean, even when schools have trainings on whatever those 2 hours are after school or an hour after school, when we have those short days, we still can't have all of the office staff there. We still can't have all of the janitorial staff there. We still can't have everyone on campus there because people have jobs that start once school ends. And so how do we create that space to make sure all staff members in WCCUSD are being trained, even the staff that's over there at the district level, in payroll, in purchasing, and everywhere? How do we make sure that all those people get that training? Because in some way or form, they're impacting education. And I think I think a bold move from the board would be to make a statement saying we are going to continue this. And if it's every Friday or one Friday a month where all staff is off and we're having these trainings regionally, or maybe not all at Richmond, not all in the Richmond auditorium, but figuring out some type of system where we can have these type of trainings because I think they're extremely important. I think that we need to make sure we have experts there teaching it, because if truth be told, some of the people in the training, I was like, I know students who specifically have called you out about your behavior and your anti-Black behavior. And so I was just shocked to see some of that happening as well, if truth be told. So how do we make sure that if we are having leads for next year, how do we make sure that those leads are people who are really invested and not just, they're the only ones who volunteered. They're the only ones who were willing to even take hold of this work and to take the lead of this work. How do we do that? And so those are some things I think you should think about. But also, I think the last measure is an accountability system. We have to figure out, how are we measuring growth and progress of our staff? Are they learning something new? Are they giving some type of feedback? What do we have as a measurement tool to say that there has been some, like there's some use in these trainings? Because even though me individually may have found it useful, I definitely have staff on our campus who have stated in our reports that they don't find it useful. They don't think it's necessary. And they believe that just because of COVID, that's why kids are experiencing these things and not because real student voice is valid. And so what are we doing for that? How are we measuring it? Where's the accountability with that? And so I think that's pretty much all that I wanted to mention. But I do, if the district's gonna hold, lastly, if the district's gonna hold these district level trainings, how they were gonna do some Fridays, we have to be consistent. We gotta make sure that we don't cancel those a week or two before and then leave it to the staff who's not really well trained to try to create something out of whatever we kind of quickly research. We want to make sure we have experts who are helping to create these experiences so that way everyone's actually learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Peters.
Thank you so much. Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy, before we go to comments, can we just get someone to speak to Mr. Jamil's and Mr. Cooper's question? Does everyone remember what their question was?
Yeah, so it was about curriculum and pedagogy. And I'm going to attempt to speak to, although it is 6 o'clock and I've been on Zoom since 8, so I'm super tired. But I appreciate this conversation. I'm going to attempt to be brief. So I think a question that we've been asking in education forever has been, what are we going to do to make sure that the curriculum that we're giving to students, particularly students furthest from power, is relevant, right? So there are a lot of different answers to that. California has recently adopted ethnic studies curriculum. Of course, that is mainly for high school, and it's rooted in critical race theory, although it's rooted in critical race theory light, I would say. There are a lot of different curricular examples that could be cited. I know Mr. Cooper asked for some specific examples, but I think the essential question for me is, can you teach anti-racist curriculum if you're racist? In other words, I like to say the very best curriculum in the worst hands is a weapon. So for Chris and myself, our theory of action is always not to start with curriculum. As educators, we want the top 3 things that we can do to shift and make a change. This question gets posed to me all the time. Rochelle, I'm meeting with you. Give me the top 3 things I need to do so I can go in Monday and make a change. That is not how anti-racist work happens. It just isn't. And consistently, I keep getting questions from educators. What's the 3 magic bullets? Tell me the 3 things. Today, I got a question from someone. How can just tell me what to do on Saturday, so on Monday, I can go in and do this anti-racist work. That's not how it works. If it was gonna work like that, we would have fixed it by now. If it was gonna work like that, culturally relevant pedagogy, when Gloria Ladson-Billings talked about that, we would have fixed it by now. If it was gonna work like, okay, so now I'm preaching. So my point is, that's not what works. So maybe we should stop trying to look for the top 3 things, the best, latest curriculum, read the best, latest book, and then we'll have all the answers. What has to shift people is us. This is people work. So back to my question, can you teach anti-racist pedagogy if you were racist? The answer is no. You can teach something, but it won't land the same way because you haven't shifted. And so we began our work with equity leads, telling the equity leads, this is about you and your work. Brene Brown says you lead based upon who you are. Rochelle Rogers-Art says you lead based upon who you are and your racial context. Teaching is a form of leading. You must do the work. And if things aren't working well, it's because we've not done our own personal work. It is not as simple as finding the right curriculum. I do agree that we should be teaching curriculum that speaks to our students. Yes, I agree there should be ethnic studies. I agree there should be African studies. We need to be able to teach that African people didn't start on the Mayflower or whatever, right? That there was a whole history of folks in Africa, but curriculum is not enough. Someone asked, what's the difference between curriculum and pedagogy? The reality is, if you are using anti-racist pedagogy, it's because you yourself are working on becoming actively anti-racist. Because pedagogy is the how, curriculum is the what. And if you are interested in really figuring out how to shift, maybe you have a whole group of people who have decided they're going to work towards being critically anti-racist. And then you can take the whitest curriculum, because I taught during open court, and it was the whitest of white curricula, but that was not the way I taught that to my students, because I was actively moving towards anti-racism. So I've been able to take different types of curricula and shift it and move it and teach things so that my students can get it. That's what pedagogy is. Content is what curriculum is. So I wanted to hit that. I want to also hit, you can't teach what you don't know. So when we talk about when are we going to teach certain types of curricula to students, that becomes about a larger systemic issue about what is important that we're teaching to our students. And the question becomes, out of all the things that the state says we have to teach, and out of all the things that like we know what's happening at our state level. So that's a whole nother thing. But of all those things, what are the things that we're going to be willing to bring in? How are we helping our teachers to bring in supplemental materials so that they can do this work? And as we think about, most importantly, as we think about this shift, I needed, this is gonna, okay, so this may not be, Millie says she gets in trouble, but I get to get in trouble too. The reality is this notion that like this one person is the guiding light, and if that one person doesn't do it, like take off your cape. Superman's not coming to save us. It must be a collective effort of people working together. You get in things what you put out of things. And the reality is, if we are not going into this work saying we want to change who we are as people, this is people work. This is not curriculum shifts. And if you'll notice, I worry less about my teachers, to be frank. I worry more about leaders. So I'm super consistent about that, because I feel like there are teachers who definitely, don't get me wrong, there's teachers who definitely need to be pushed out. But I'm also concerned about my site leads, because they're trying to do this work, and how are we supporting them in doing the work, or how are we shifting the ones who aren't doing the work? And then finally, I'm just going to end with this. Listen, people, the notion that, I keep saying this, the notion that 6 months with me and Chris and racism is going to be over, I mean, okay, that's not relevant and not going to happen, right? And this is what Chris was talking about in critical race theory, the permanence of racism. So, please don't ever expect that you're going to hire the best of anybody and in 6 months it's all going to be over. What we are on is a journey to make things better. And the notion that we're going to get like the 5 little bullets that's going to make it happen is flawed. Instead, let's look at what can we control right here in this area for the next 9 months. We got 9 months. What can we do for the next 9 months? Okay, and then we evaluate that, not from a place of, let's get away from our white supremacist thinking that we have to have white modes of evaluating, but let's look at what type of growth we think happened as a result of these engagements as people. And then we try to move to the next level on the, on the agenda. So we had a pilot. There were some growth areas. There were some areas of real great highs, and there were some things that did not work well. Your job as the board now is to be like, okay, how do we build on what we learned, lessons learned? What are the pieces that we need to do better for year one? Because our first year was just a pilot, right? I hope that's really, really helpful. I do want to end with this, like, listen, as a consultant, it is always difficult because, and I'm sure Millie feels this too, there's a sense of people thinking, well, you know, what did you spend all that money for if we didn't get all these answers? And what I hope that people will understand is, I hope that you, for those who were participatory in some of the equity lay work and those who are participating in the leading within racism work that is still ongoing, that you understand the shift has to come from within. That I cannot possibly, when I look at my 16-year-old who attends school in Oakland and he's 11th grader, I can't possibly tell him to do anything different until I model what my difference is. And so my hope for everyone in West Contra Costa is that we're looking at what is our do different first within ourselves, and then in how we communicate with each other.
Thank you so much for that. Trustee Gonzalez Hoy, I'm going to pretend I heard you say 6:30, 6:40, because I want to give everyone on the panel a chance to say something before we say something, just as a valuing that voice that's in the room. So Ms. Burns, of course, is going to go first. So we're going to have Ms. Burns go. We know Ms. Smith is taking care of that sweet newborn. So we're going to go Ms. Burns, and then Mr. Sato Wilson, please, then Mr. Mcgee, Ruben, and then Trustee Gonzalez Hoy, and then me. If we could do it in that order, that would be great. And then, and Miss Dr. Rogers, if you have anything else to add, please. So Miss Burns.
I wanted to piggyback on Dr. Rogers' comments. Anti-racist education doesn't begin in secondary school. If we can revive the art of teaching, if we can have anti-racist learning environments, if our teachers feel free to teach our children to think, to assess, to analyze from preschool on, we have a win. I get concerned when all of the discussion of curriculum and pedagogy seems to go to middle and high school. The joy of learning is destroyed in preschool, kindergarten, first, second grade. So reviving the art of teaching can start with helping administrators, leaders, teachers understand what an anti-racist learning environment looks like, acts like, sounds like, functions. That a racist learning environment is no longer allowed. That we're not suspending and expelling preschoolers and kindergartners. Okay? But most of all, we're empowering teachers to teach. They have to have the time. Are they going to have to devote their time to preparing kids to pass a test that has its own racist origins? Or are we empowering them to be creative, to actually teach? This is part of the process of systemic change. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Burns. I really appreciate that. Mr. Wilson, if you have any final comments or any action steps or ask of us?
Sure. I just want to address the matter of curriculum for Black history. So the question I've been asking just for the past year or two or so, why is it that we just can't set aside 15 minutes a day for something Black, starting at the elementary school, starting to pre-K level, and build upon that? What I've been seeing is that wait till February, and then the expectation is based on our Black staff to put something together for February. And then once February ends, we are done. Black History Month is 365 days a year. So why is it that like we can't roll out something? Okay, we need to start integrating this. And if you don't know how to teach this, if you are not Black, then here's what you need to do. I don't know why this is not happening right now. It happened when I went to school in Oakland. I mean, we were doing assignments and whatnot, and we were, it could even be as matters like, when you are selecting text for your English classes, Black authors, Black artists, Black literature. So when you have February, which is already, we have only 3 weeks, as Millie just put in the chat here,
we only have 3 weeks, and that doesn't really give you enough time. And it just basically, okay, here's what we did. And that's why we end up hearing the same thing over and over again. So that's what I'm curious about. We just start incorporating this into all classes and figure out how to do it. Now, if teachers out there thinking, well, that's going to get in the way of our curriculum, then don't teach. Because you need to make space to educate everyone, because you're not just educating Black students about Black history. Responsibility to educate everyone about it. So how will that work? How will that work? And the curriculum has to be legit. Don't just throw something out there like, oh, I found this online. Because just because it says Black History Month, that curriculum could be created by colonization as well, and false information. So there's that too. So start incorporating that and just start integrating that in your lessons. So you have standards for Common Core or whatnot. Should be able to have the same when it comes to addressing the needs and education of Black history and Black students.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wilson. I really appreciate that. Mr. Mcgee.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for this conversation. I mean, I know this is just really scratching the surface, but this is important. And there is a lot of work to be done. And there was a lot of talk and things that were touched upon. There are things that are happening that we do have to strengthen, such as our hiring practices, such as the policies and procedures in the district. And I mentioned something earlier, and it really is about honesty. We have to really figure out how we as a district can be honest. We have to be honest with our stakeholders, our constituents, our parents, guardians, and our staff. And so this year was a lot of learning. We learned what went well, we learned what did not go well. And so we have to talk about that. And then we also have to make sure that this work is not superficial. This work really has to do what we needed to do. You know, the curriculum is part of it. The hiring practices is the other part of it. And so those are all things that we are looking at strengthening as a district, but we just have to not give it lip service and allow people to do this work. We do have some effective employees here, but if we're going to be handcuffed and we're not going to be able to do this work, then it's all in vain. So that's the message I would give you all as the policymakers, is give us that support. You know, allow us to do what we need to do, provide the checks and balances so we can get this done. Along with our West Contra Costa Administrators Association, United Teachers of Richmond, Teamsters, SSA School Services or Supervisors Association, there are people that want to do this work. But, and I'll wrap it up here, if we as a people are not comfortable with saying Black Lives Matter, or if a family challenges us and says, well, what about blue lives? Blue lives matter. And if we don't arm ourselves with just the knowledge of blue lives is a choice, and once you take that uniform off, I don't know if you're a police officer, but my Black life is not a choice. And whenever I walk out this house, you know I'm Black. If we're not arming ourselves with that type of discourse and language, we're doing a disservice. So I'll just say we need the support. This work needs to continue. We have to figure out how to integrate it, and we have to give people the planning time so we can get this work done for all levels of this organization.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mcgee. Mr. Aurelio, do you have anything that you want to add?
I mean, echoing what everyone said, of course, but I go back to my roots, which is I started my career as a second grade teacher. And I owned every kid's literacy at that point. I wanted to make sure that any kid that left my classroom, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke at home, had the ability to read when they left my classroom. And if we're going to make any significant difference, is arming our students, our Black students, our brown students with the ability to read. And how do we need to triple, quadruple our efforts to make sure that every kid in this district is reading by third grade and beyond. I mean, that's one thing, that's access, that's everything. And we obviously need to examine our curriculum, you know, because we know the importance of curriculum can have, but I agree with Rochelle Rogers-Ard about you have to start with yourself And if you're not anti-racist and you're not teaching anti-racist ideals, you're not going to reach kids at the level you need to reach them. So I'll leave it at that. The importance of reading in everything we do. It gives them access as they move into secondary schools, because we know that has not changed. And I know I'm going to keep my things short because we're at time, and I want to make sure you both have time to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Aurelio. Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy, your final thoughts?
Thank you, Trustee Smith-Folds, and thank you everybody for being here, and honestly also staying after, because I know we're going over our time. And Dr. Rogers-Art, if that your closing statement was you tired, I want to really hear you when you're with energy. That was incredible. I appreciate everything all of you said. I will try not to take more than a couple of minutes because I've been talking a lot, but you know, I've seen as part of the system for a few years, and really not that long, for only 8 years in the system, I have seen racism and failure in our system in every level, from classified staff all the way to board members. In those 8 years, I've seen many, many examples. And as I was hearing everybody talk, more and more examples would pop into my head of things I've seen over time. So, you know, today, as we were heading into this conversation, someone asked me, why are you all doing this? Why are you having another study session around this when we've been looking at this all year? And I had a really hard time answering that because it kind of caught me by surprise, but it shouldn't have, because there's a reason why every year I see these issues. And that question itself answered why they were asking that. I've 4 years ago, I saw a 6-year-old boy, Latino, get arrested in a school because staff couldn't handle that he was running around. He got handcuffed in front of me, he got put in a police car and taken to a hospital. 6-year-old. This was a first grader. The data that Mr. Aurelio presented to us in December, that's all about race, right? That 16% of our African-American students are at math grade level is ridiculous. 15% of our Latinos. 29% of our African-American students are reading at grade level. 23% of Latinos are reading at grade level. That is why we need to continue to have these conversations. And that's why the work that all of you are doing every day is one of the most important things that we should be doing right now. So I want to say thank you, because this work is not just in the classroom, it's at every level, and it totally trickles down to our kids. Last year, I was serving in a committee before I became a board member, and there were 3 students who served in this committee with me. And they saw the chair of the committee tell me that I couldn't serve as committee chair because of my immigration status. And 2 of the 3 were Latinos. This was the chair of this committee. This is a year ago. I constantly pull examples and the importance of this work. And the reason why I give that example is because of those 3 kids that were there. They saw that happen. It was not about the adults, it's about them and how that affected them. They didn't speak the rest of the meeting. I actually didn't see them speak ever again in that committee. And I connected to that. We have to do better because of the data that I mentioned. We have to do better, and we have to continue to do this work, and we have to lead it from top to bottom. I see it as a sandwich work, right? We have to do the work in the classroom, in the sites, and we have to do it all the way from the board level. I think Trustee Smith-Folds, one of our failures, not yours and I, but as a board, as a whole, is that we haven't had this conversation and that we didn't push harder that for our first retreat, we should talk about race and equity. I think that this is an opportunity, though, that I think that one of our recommendations is that as soon as possible, with our new leader, we have a race and equity conversation. That would be my first one that I think that we have to bring forward to the rest of the board. We are so heavy on saying things in our board. We stand for a lot of resolutions. We stand for a lot of grandstanding. I think that this is maybe why you, Trustee Smith-Folds, and I are not maybe meant to do this work long term, because I cringe every time we create a new initiative, a new school, a new resolution, and we don't connect it with implementation and how we're going to set up staff to succeed. We never really have that follow-up and the conversation about what does Dr. Rogers and Dr. Knotts need to succeed in implementing this long-term, or Ms. Burns or Ms. Smith, right? We haven't revisited our policy on race and equity a single time since we've been on the board, but really in how long before that? Okay, I'm rambling, but I think that ultimately it comes down to we need to revisit those conversations. We need to have this conversation at the forefront. I think that we have to, as a recommendation, we need to send the budget committee a recommendation to look at how they can fund training for equity and our equity and race leads. I think that should be a recommendation that comes out of today. Send it to them and ask them to figure out how to find the funding. But I think for me, the first step is to have a conversation as a full board on race and equity. And I would love if Dr. Rogers, Art, if you and Mr. Knotts would lead that with Ms. Burns. I would love to imitate this conversation and take it even deeper. Not in 2 hours, but a full day conversation about what race and equity needs are in the district. I think it's so critical. Anyways, I just want to thank Trustee Smith-Folds for making sure that we had this. And I think that our committee is probably one of the only ones in the whole district that created an equity statement on purpose as one of the first things that we did. So I want to thank you for the leadership, Trustee Smith-Folds. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy. If you don't feel like you swallowed rocks, you wasn't listening. If there's not a pit sitting in your stomach right now, then you wasn't listening. So all of us who feel emotionally heavy right now, you were listening. All of you who feel exhausted right now, you were listening. I remember when I was a kid, my mom had a conversation with me. My dad had a conversation with my brother, and my mom had a conversation with me. And my mom said, I want you to understand something. There's going to be a time when someone's going to try to control you with control your body, control your mind, control you economically, control you socially. You can't let that happen. There's going to be a time where you're going to feel like isolated. There's going to be a time where you're going to feel exasperated. There's going to be a time where you're going to feel as if you are literally in an abusive, toxic situation. And I'm sitting there and I'm listening to my mom talk about this. And my dad was having a conversation with my brother in the other room about the same thing. And I'm listening to this conversation. At the end of it, she says, I know you think I'm talking about a boy. She said, I'm talking about racism in America. And she laid it flat like that. And what I've come to learn is race in this country is an abusive partner. We are kidnapped and then forced to couple with both physically, mentally, socially, and economically. I am forced to be with you. And every time I try to get out, you lie to me. You buy me flowers. You say we're going to counseling. You try to make it better and you stop hitting me for just a little bit. And then for a short time, only for a short time do you stop hitting me and then you become you again. That's racism in this country. She knew I was talking about it. That's my mama again. That's racism in this country. So those are the conversations that we at a board level, we at a district level, we at a staff level, we at a site level, we at a teacher level, and we as a parent level have to start understanding what racism is in this country. It is an abusive partner. And everyone knows that the hardest time and the most dangerous time when you're in an abusive relationship is when you decide to get out. That's statistics say it. When you decide to get out of an abusive relationship, that's when you better have a plan. You better have a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C, because that's when that other person realizes that power is gone. We as a district have to decide to get out. We have to decide to get out of the systemic racism, abusive relationship that we have been in for over 400 years. We have to make a decision. We have to make a decision and get out, and we have to be prepared to what that getting out looks like, and we have to do it with a plan. And Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy, I lay it at our feet because we are the ones who have decided that you're not going to hit me anymore. You're not going to lay hands on me anymore. So it's at our feet to make sure that we start getting a plan together for the escape. And then the longevity of the escape, because you know you can always go back to an abusive relationship because that's where you think your normal is. So we not only have to get out of this racist, abusive statement or situation that we're in this district, but we have to make sure that we're always checked so we don't go back to the normative of it. I appreciate this conversation. I look forward to more conversations. I appreciate the fact that this is a lot of work that we have to do. I appreciate the fact that we are all listening to our girlfriends. You know, when you listen to your girlfriends, they're like, honey, this ain't right. You doing something toxic. And you finally start listening. I appreciate that we are at a district, Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy, we're listening. We know that this is not how every relationship is supposed to be, even though every relationship that we've seen is like this, that it's a racist, abusive, toxic relationship. So this is the day that we get out. This is the day that we start making a plan. I appreciate all of you. I value all of you. Thank you for everything that you put in this every single day by the virtue of who you are and who God made you to be. We will continue. We will keep moving. We will keep moving forward. Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy will talk offline and see how we can push and pull where we need to go on the board level. We have to push or we have to pull. We will make sure that we get there. Again, everyone, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This was such a needed conversation, and it's something that we need to say it every time we breathe. Every time we breathe in and every time we exhale out, we have to center this conversation. So, Mr. Aurelio, I appreciate you. Ms. Burns, I appreciate you. Ms. Rogers, Dr. Rogers, I really appreciate you. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Thank you, Mr. Mcgee. Thank you, Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy. Please get some rest. It's a heavy conversation. Get some rest, have some reflection, and let's just be better. I think we're finished. Oh, hold on, I gotta remember. Our next section, I was just about to walk away. Our next academic committee is May 24th. We're going 4 o'clock to 5:30 because we are going to leave space for us all to get ready for the reclassification of our students. On June 7th, we're having another special meeting. We're having a special meeting around special education, but we're also understanding that that's centered in this conversation. We cannot have a conversation about special ed if we're not centering the fact of the disparities in our Black and Brown community. On June 28th, listen, honey, we may not have that meeting. We just, Mr. Rayleigh, you may have to delete. We may not have that meeting because both of us are unavailable, but we will pick it back up. Future agenda items are 24th. We are going to talk about the virtual school, and we're going to talk about the Afrocentric school. Trustee Gonzalez-Hoy, anything else to add to this?
No, thank you very much.
It's great, and it's 6:40. I like to leave on an even number. Okay, it is 6:40. We are adjourned. I appreciate all of you. Thank you so much for the hard conversation. We did it in a soft way, and that's how we have to continue to work in this district. Hard conversations in a soft way. Thank you, and good night, everyone.